Your burger is served. And this is our finest Pepsi Zero Sugar. Its sweet profile perfectly balances the savory notes of your burger.
That is one perfect combination. Burgers deserve Pepsi.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this season we've been looking at various revolutions from the 18th century. We've talked about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and today we're talking about a person whose life kind of, I would say, straddled, and I mean straddled maybe in a sexy way, because you'll hear why I said that soon, but both the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And we've talked before on this season, on this podcast, about some other people who were going in between America and France, people like Lafayette, Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings. And this is a name I had never heard of before, but he was also going back and forth. And I know I had never heard this name before because it's a really specific and interesting name. His name is Gouvernour Morris. We talk about this in the episode you're about to hear. He was, if you look in the all-encompassing way, like who were the founding fathers of America, he was one of those guys. You know, he's in the room where it happens. He's not in the musical Hamilton, but I think that's just because if he was, there'd be too much competition for like who is the biggest, horniest dirtbag. And in that musical, Hamilton himself has to take over that role, which is also why Aaron Burr is represented the way he is in the musical. We talk about this all in the episode. I just want to give you some heads up information who we're talking about. Gouvernour. We explain why that's his name as well. And I do want to give a shout out to a listener of this podcast whose name is Kim, who I met when I was doing a meetup in Florida a bit ago. The people at the meetup, I was just sort of trying to think about some spoilers, some teases about some episodes that are coming up. And I mentioned I was going to do this one with Gouvernour Morris, specifically because I was interested how many American people have heard of him. And Kim shared that actually when she was going to school, I think middle school, everyone in the class was assigned a person from this revolutionary age to research, and she was assigned Gouvernour. So maybe some other people out there were forced to learn about this guy. And the context of the conversation I'm having with today's guest. Today's guest is Cassandra Good. She's a historian. Her expertise is in American history. And she has a new course that's just come out. You can go, as soon as you listen to this podcast, go and subscribe to it right away on the great courses. And it's called Early American Sex Scandals, which there's a lot of, as much as I'm Canadian for context, but so much of what I have experienced about the way that many American people consider their past is that the founding fathers and their wives were all really upright, moral, cool, just ethical people. And it's actually they were all kind of we'll talk about it in the episode. We'll get into what they're really like. But Gouvernour, sometimes there are people in history, and I'm always kind of sad to hear that their diaries were destroyed by their later descendants. But Gouvernour's diaries were not destroyed by his descendants, and that's how we know a lot about the sexy secrets. And this is also, if you've been listening to other episodes of this podcast recently, we talk about Dangerous Liaisons. We talked about that movie a bit ago, but what was Gouvernour's connection to that book and to the way that people behaved in that book, but also he interacts with several of the people from the American Revolution that you've probably heard of too. And he was in Paris. He went to Paris in the midst of the French Revolution, which is a real choice because a lot of people were fleeing Paris, but he just kind of showed up there with his sexy peg leg and just you'll hear what he did. And I will give a trigger warning for the cause of death of him, because spoiler, this person who lived several hundred years ago is dead. The cause of death makes me cringe every time I hear it. So just know that. I Anyway, I'm so happy to share with you this conversation I had with Cassandra Good about Gouvernour Morris. So I'm joined today by Cassandra Good, who is a historian of, how would you describe your usual history research? Just American history, colonial American history?
I would say early American cultural and gender history. So I've written about friendships between men and women, and I've written sort of family history biography, and now I'm working on a project on women in politics. So a lot about relationships and politics and gender.
And what you're looking at is kind of is it social history necessarily? Like you're looking at kind of the lives. You're not looking at like, here's the battle and here's the strategies. Like you're looking at who are the people and what were their relationships like and what did they live like?
Yeah, so it's interesting when I was in grad school and I had the option of taking either cultural history or social history, and I was like, well, what is the difference? And at the sort of technical level, social history tends to be more bottom up, especially people who are not elites type history, and cultural history more often is elite people, artwork, letters. So that's why I tend to say cultural history, but like in a general sense, social lives, yes.
No, that's interesting. That's not a distinction I had heard before. Because the closest I've found to my research interest is social history, because I like learning about people and what their lives were like and whether they were like a more wealthy person or not. Like I find that interesting. But I guess that's kind of both because it's kind of, yeah.
Well, and so cultural history comes out of a moment in mostly the 1980s when historians started reading anthropology a lot, and particularly work by this guy, Clifford Geertz. And he talked about this idea of webs of meaning. And so the way I think about what I'm doing is kind of ethnography of the past, trying to understand people's relationships and lives and values, and looking at that as if, the past is a foreign country. These people live, even though they're speaking the same language, I can't assume that the words even always mean the same thing then as they do now. And so cultural history pays a lot of attention to things like that. Like, what does this symbol mean in the context of the time? So I think you're doing some of that.
I think I'm doing kind of both, maybe. So what we're talking about today, well, we're specifically talking about a man from American history who went to Paris during the time of the revolution, and we'll talk about why he did that because people were fleeing and he just arrived. But this is in the larger context of a course that you have available. Can you explain what the overall course is about so people understand?
Sure. So it's a course from a partnership with the Great Courses, which has a lot of video courses and also Audible courses, and then with audible.com. So it's a 6-part audio series called Early American Sex Scandals. And so each one focuses on, sometimes it's just one person. Sometimes I have one episode that's also on seduction novels. So it's all centered on late 18th through 19th century America.
And so you talk about like one of them, the other stories, not what we're talking about today, but you do get into Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, which we've talked about on a previous episode. So Thomas Jefferson spent time in Paris, but so did this other person. And can you explain who this person is and why he has the name he has?
Yes, so Gouvernour Morris, and there's debate about pronunciation of his name. I generally just go with Gouvernour, but I've heard multiple different options there. And this is one of those strange names that come from using his mother's maiden name is his first name. So there are multiple people in early America where they did this. The first name is something strange sounding as a first name because it was actually a last name.
You know who else is like that? Beyonce. That's her mother's maiden name.
Oh, interesting.
Fun fact. And the reason that her mother just wrote a memoir, and that's how I know this. But the reason that her mother, like, she knew she's having a girl, and she's like, no one in my family's having sons. Like, this last name is going to die out, so I'll give my child. And her husband was like, you're calling her child Beyonce? Like, she's going to be teased. This is such an unusual name. And now it's like, how famous is that name?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so his mother was Sarah Gouvernour from New York, from a Dutch family. New York was the old original Dutch colony in North America.
So is that the same sort of thing? Like, you give the child the mother's maiden name as sort of a tribute to her?
I don't know exactly what the decision making was with this. I'm trying to think whether it's usually, something like a second son versus, because often a first son is going to be named with the same name as the father, not always. So I'm trying to think. So his father's name was Lewis. That would have been much easier to pronounce to just say Lewis Morris. But
But his name is, yeah, like it looks like Governor, but it's Gouvernour. So
well,
when
it's
you
got
first
that
mentioned,
extra, it has two U's in it. So
yeah, so when I first saw the name, I thought, oh, Gouvernour Morris, that's his title, but what's his first name? No, his name is Gouvernour, and it's not like the name Gouvernour. I just want to emphasize this to people. That was the mother's surname, a Dutch surname. It's not like how, people sometimes give their child an aspirational name like King or Majesty
right.
to be like, this is gonna, elevate my child and, inspire them. They weren't like, one day our son will be a governor. And in
No.
fact, he wasn't a governor, was he?
He was not, but he was very important in American history, despite the fact that most people have never heard of him, because he was in charge of making the Constitution's wording sound good. And he pretty much wrote the preamble to the Constitution. So he actually is quite an important person in US history.
Is he technically a founding father or not?
Well, it depends how you define founding father,
You
but
please
if
define it
I
for
mean,
me.
I think for some people, founding father is any of the people involved in the Constitutional Convention or in the American Revolution. Some people are looking at like a fairly narrow set of people when they're talking about founding fathers. So they're thinking really of like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams. But there's a whole group of people there that is involved. Somebody like Benjamin Rush is somebody on the edges who is basically a founding father. He's involved in the founding and very influential, um, but not very well known. So, I mean, as smart as the guys were that we know of, there's also these other people, including also, I would say, women. I talk about a lot of women in this period who I think are influential and really part of the founding. So the project that publishes, there's an online platform for all of the presidential papers from this period that have been published and some non-presidential, and they just call it Americans of the Founding Era.
Okay. So
So but founding fathers is basically a 20th century term.
for me as a Canadian person who mostly encountered the concept of the founding fathers from like an episode of, Family Matters where they had to do a school report or like Sesame Street or something, I'm just like, I'm learning this against my will. So to me, it's like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and then since the musical, Hamilton.
Hamilton, yes.
To me,
And
those are the guys. Those are kind of the core guys.
I will also say, for anybody who is familiar with the Hamilton musical, one of the episodes I have in this course is on the Reynolds affair. And the big spoiler alert is that Hamilton may not have had an affair with Mariah Reynolds. He might have been using that as a cover story for actual financial misdeeds, which were much more serious than just paying off the husband of a woman he was having an affair with.
That's that. I love that historians find things like this where it's like, well, this was the story, and then let's research the story. But then when you dive a bit deeper, you're like, oh, that's what he wanted us to think. But what was really happening? That's where historians are kind of detectives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, this was not my own detective work. There was a documentary editor, meaning somebody who worked on publishing presidential papers, who really dug deep on this and noticed that the letters, so we don't have originals of the Mariah Reynolds correspondence. There's just the pamphlet with the published version, but the wording in them is off in certain ways. And so he thinks Hamilton made them up.
These are just like messy, messy people who are, again, to me as a Canadian, held up as these like saintly, flawless figures. And I love that people like you are out there doing the history to be like, well, let's just look at them as people. What were they actually like?
Yeah, and it makes it more relatable. And I mean, the other thing I say about this to my students often, because there's people that are uncomfortable with the idea of showing that the founders were flawed people, to me, it shows that, we are all flawed people. We know about our own flaws. That doesn't mean we cannot do great things if these flawed people did great things. So to me, it's actually very encouraging that they were not perfect.
And again, I've been helped a lot by my American friends to understand American history. Just when I finally had to learn about all of this, unavoidably because of the topic of my podcast, but it was presented to me the concept that, and I think where you said your students are uncomfortable with this idea of them being flawed, is when you think of the people of the founding era. it's kind of like, and they created this country. And so it's like to find a flaw in them is like to find a flaw in the country because they're so related to it. So it's like insulting America to insult one of these guys.
And I'd say my students actually are fairly comfortable with this. It is, I think, an older generation of people in the country who, had grown up revering the founders, which was very much part of like a 1950s and Cold War moment. And I think they are the ones much more than a younger generation who is concerned about this.
Yeah. So like just, spoiler for listeners, we're going to talk about this guy and his sex life, which was chaotic.
And he was very close friends with Alexander Hamilton.
Just a bunch of guys, just like locker room talk, really. So, Gouverneur Morris. So, he's a wealthy person in America at the time of the Revolutionary era. He was
Right.
on the side of the revolution, presumably.
Yes, he
He's a
was.
lawyer, right?
He has legal training, but he basically is also sort of financier, does a lot of financial stuff. He did an important financial report during the revolution. And then the reason he goes to France in 1788 is to make business deals.
Right. And so, can you explain to people, because we've talked a bit about on other episodes, the back and forth of France and America. So, at the time of the revolution, France was supporting the revolution side, mostly because that meant screwing over England, and England and France were always at odds. So, it was not unusual for American businessmen to be like going back and forth to Paris. And I would think, especially where his mother was European, maybe he felt some sort of draw to the continent too. I don't know.
So I'm not sure I think his mother was actually born in the US. She was just Dutch
Oh, okay.
ancestry.
Yeah.
And the Dutch weren't actually in New York that long, but left a big impact. But yeah, Americans, it's not a pleasant boat journey back then to go across the Atlantic, but they did it a surprising amount given how unpleasant it was. And, the fact is, the colonial America was completely dependent on trade with Europe. And after the revolution, that's the case too, after the American Revolution. And France is a really important ally for the new United States. And so it makes sense to go to where there's a lot of money to go make trade deals.
That's true because it's this young country and they need to like really solidify themselves as a financially stable place that can continue on and be a country. So he goes over to Paris the first time, and you said
88.
1788.
Yeah, so he's not going with the government, he's just going on his own at that point. And Thomas Jefferson is the ambassador at that point. So they're hanging out together in Paris.
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking. The Sally Hemings episodes. I remember Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings left Paris just before the 1789, the storming of the Bastille and everything, both because the weather was really cold and also because it was getting a little tense to be there. But Gouverneur arrives on the precipice of the French Revolution. But at this point, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was not just people going back and forth between Paris and the US, but also there's inspiration of like, wow, America had this revolution. Maybe France can too. We can all be the new Rome. Republicans are like small r. Let's do a republic. Like the vibes were like they were inspiring each other with their sort of pamphlets and brochures and philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the French Revolution is very much inspired by the American Revolution. And, again, for people who've seen Hamilton, you know that there's debate over how much America should support France, given that, they had signed a treaty of alliance during the American Revolution. And I think that the revolution went down a path in France that really scared a lot of people in America. And certainly the Federalists, which is the party Gouverneur Morris is part of, and also Hamilton and Washington, they become fairly anti-French in part because of what happens with the revolution.
And so at the beginning, this is where it's like things change so quickly in terms of the French Revolution and just kind of who's in charge and what's going on. But at first, like Thomas Jefferson, I think people in France were writing sort of like documents being like declaring their rights and stuff. And Thomas Jefferson is like, oh, I can help you write that. Like I wrote something like that myself. And it's very idealistic at the beginning. And I feel like that's where Gouverneur shows up when it's in this idealistic phase of like, yes, power to the people. Like, let's do this. Let's be like the Romans, and no idea of how bananas it's going to get. But that's the situation he walks into. He's not walking into the middle of the terror.
Right, but he's there during the terror. He
Oh, well,
stays.
we will get to that because that was a question I had. So he shows up and he's hanging out with Thomas Jefferson. Presumably, he would have seen Sally Hemings, who was there. Her brother would have made them food, macaroni and cheese, potentially. And so but he's there doing business deals. He's not there for political reasons as of yet.
Yeah, and they're doing a bunch of diplomatic dinners because, he's American. He does seem to have been pretty good at speaking French, but, fairly early on, he's observing the kind of relationships that men in Paris, men and women, are having, and he's kind of uncomfortable with it, and he's not intending to be part of that whole scene at the beginning because he keeps a diary. We're very lucky that he keeps a diary while he's there that is extremely detailed, including entire conversations he has. And so he says at the beginning of his time there that this guy at a dinner, this French guy, wants to know who Morris's lovers are. And Morris is like, so his quote is, "I have none, and am not like to have any. Besides that, I dare not hazard offending a virtuous woman." And the guy just laughed and was like, "Yeah, the women here will not be offended."
This is the most French thing I can possibly imagine. I feel like if you go there today and you meet someone, they're like, "Tell me about your lovers. How many are there?" That just feels like that's just what France is like.
Yeah, I mean,
So
the attitude is totally different, especially there among the very high elite people, because the very high elite people in Paris and London are going pretty wild.
and they have been for a while. And so we were talking about this a bit before we recorded, but sort of the cultural difference at this point is that America, well, explain to me how you explained it to me before. Like they really wanted to be like ancient Rome and very like ethical and moral. And France was just like, woo, like whatever, who cares? Effectively.
Right. So there's a lot of rhetoric in America at this point about forming a democratic republic, and they're especially interested in reading ancient Roman stuff. And that is their inspiration for a republic, their inspiration for architecture, and one big value in Latin virtus, or virtue, the idea that you needed to be virtuous to have a republic. And this makes some sense. If you're going to be ruled by the people, if the people are all corrupt and immoral, how are they going to rule the country? And I mean, John Adams even wrote at a certain point, he was worried that Americans were not virtuous enough to sustain a republic. And so they're really kind of obsessing over being virtuous, and what that means for them in terms of sexual morals is they're not going to sleep around the way the elites in England and France do. And frankly, middle class people in those places are not really doing that either. And in fact, in England, when George III becomes king, he's very much into the same kind of morality that the Americans are talking about. He doesn't have affairs. His ancestors, George the First and Second, those people had affairs, but George the Third is like, no, I'm centering my family. We're going to be a virtuous family, and he was, as far as we know, faithful to his wife. So yeah, it's not just like America was super moral and England and France weren't. It's a little more layered, but in terms of the impression Americans had, they certainly looked at Europeans as being much looser.
And yet, can we talk about Gouvernour? Before he went to Paris, he was known as a bit of a ladies' man in America. Talk about his peg leg.
Yes. So the peg leg, what is so fascinating to me is that peg leg survives, and it is at the New York Historical. You can actually look it up online. I don't know if it's on display currently or not, but basically he had a carriage accident and his left leg was amputated below the knee. And so he had a peg leg. The joke among multiple people back then in his lifetime was that he had hurt his leg jumping out a window after hooking up with a lover. So even his reputation sort of goes along with the peg leg. And it is interesting that it did not slow him down. He rode on horseback, he walked, he danced. It did not seem to really affect his life that much.
I want to say in terms of like disability history,
Right.
it made him sexier, I think, because it made him seem kind of dangerous, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. Tom Foster has written an article from a disability history perspective on Gouverneur Morris and his sexuality and the peg leg, if anybody wants to look that up. But Morris himself didn't really talk about it. So, unless you know that about him, if you're reading his diary and stuff, you'd have no idea. And the other thing, he also had a disfigured arm from spilling boiling water as a teenager on his arm. But, he's over 6 feet tall. He smiles a lot. He's super charming. And I mean, clearly he was attractive to women because he's not necessarily just throwing himself at women. Women are throwing themselves at him, at least if we believe him.
I'm just looking at a portrait of him because I like to confirm when I hear about someone in history was hot, I'm like, were they really? And I feel like for him, it must have been a real charisma thing because he looks pretty average. But these are him as an older person.
Right. If you see him older, it's, I mean, Hamilton, if you look at Hamilton, even on the $10 bill, is very attractive.
Well, and I think too, if he was, in this era, if you're 6 feet tall, I think that just gets people's attention in general.
A surprising number of the founders were that tall. Washington and Monroe, and I think Jefferson all were
I
that
think
tall.
Jefferson was tall as well, yeah, and that's why they got in charge because people looked up to them, literally. So he's this. uh, He has this reputation. I just want to say before he gets to Paris, like he has a peg leg. It's like, oh, it's because of his like sexual adventures. So he's showing up there. He's not coming out of like a monastery.
Right.
And he's like, oh my God, France, what? These loose women. But he gets into it pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising to me that he even, I wonder how much he's playing up his morality because he thinks that French people will expect Americans to be like that. Certainly, anybody who knew John Adams from his time there might think Americans were going to be pretty straight laced. Jefferson, not as much, but certainly did not go wild in the way that Gouverneur Morris did.
But he's still there as a businessman. Like he's not there in a official capacity. But again, so it's such an interesting thing because we now looking back know the French Revolution, how it's going to carry on and be this thing. But the wealthy at the time don't know that the guillotine is about to be invented and what's going to happen to them. So he's in this kind of higher class echelon.
Right.
Meanwhile, the market ladies are on the street writing about flour. And he's just like, I'm going to hang out here for a while. This seems like a cool place to be.
Yeah, he does not really talk about how challenging things are. And even when things go bad, really bad, there just aren't that many entries in his diary. His diary is mostly covering who he's calling on, who he's having dinner with, some of the conversations he has, and then who he's sleeping with.
And this is like an interesting addition to this season or these episodes I've been doing on the podcast because to the people on the streets, like the women I've been talking about, the revolution was everything. It was every waking minute, like you were in that. But him and the people he's hanging out with, these higher class French people, it kind of shows like this wasn't really affecting them at all, really, at this point.
When he first gets there, yeah. I think by the time he becomes ambassador in 1792, I assume it was enough worse that it was affecting his life.
Noticeable at that point. Yeah. So he's there and he's writing these diaries. And like in anything in history, it's like, well, these are his diaries. So we're going to take him at his word, basically, because what else can we do? It's better than taking somebody else's description of him. And he's talking about the women he's involved with. So who is the first woman we know that he took up with?
The main person, really, his main lover for a fairly long period of time is this woman that he calls Adele. And I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of her last name. Her full name was Adelaide or Adele Villot, Comtesse de Flau. And her husband had the Comte de Flau, but I will just call her from now Adele so that my French does not offend anybody. Her husband was keeper of the king's gardens, and they had an apartment in the Louvre. So they're in this upper echelon, but they don't have a lot of money, actually. So there's some sense that she may be using Gouverneur Morris. He's never totally sure whether she's completely genuine, but they start a relationship in the summer of 1789, and he writes in a fair amount of detail. Especially, we don't usually see sources in this level of detail about sex from this period. And part of that is because we have to assume that some of that stuff got destroyed and this diary was saved. But part of it is I don't think it was as common for people to write about it.
Which is interesting because this is also the same time. I've talked in some recent episodes and some episodes coming up about it was the first woman to write about the act of breastfeeding or something. It's just kind of like these body things were not being written about widely by a lot of people at the time.
Yeah, I mean, to even say that a woman was pregnant, like, oh, you did not really mention that. I mean, even women in letters to each other would talk about like they expected to be confined, meaning like they were going to have a baby and have their period of so-called confinement where they stay in bed for a while after having the baby. I mean, they never come out and say pregnant.
Which is interesting because if we can just like sidestep into what another one of the episodes of your course is about, the seduction novels.
Right.
So books like Dangerous Liaisons, which came out 1782, were talking very frankly about sexual matters. So the fact that these novels were saying these things when people weren't talking about it, I can see how those novels were even more scandalous.
Oh, yeah. Dangerous Liaisons was not something most Americans were reading. It was considered far too scandalous. So the seduction novels are much less explicit. It's sort of implied that sex has occurred because the woman ends up getting pregnant. So there's not actual scenes describing anything. And The Coquette is the name of the most famous of these novels. But they were very, very popular. And there are ways in which those also spoke to the need for virtue, right? That if you have premarital sex, then we might say, oh, this person gets pregnant. That's not a tragic outcome. Well, in these novels, it is because then the woman dies. So it is, if you are not careful enough with men, you're going to get pregnant and die.
Yeah, they're like titillating cautionary tales, not unlike the films of Tyler Perry today. So he's writing Gouvernour. He's with Adele and they're having sex. This is in your course. People can listen to it. Because he sent me the script all over the place in public. They seem to delight in almost being caught. Like
Yes.
they are going at it in a real 50 Shades of Grey level. Like they're just like they're into it, they're doing it, and he's writing about it. And yeah, Gouvernour, like he got over his reticence quickly.
And the interesting thing about Adele is that she is a useful person to have an affair with because she's married and then she has two lovers. And at a certain point, she even has a third one. But one of her other lovers is an important figure in the French government, Talleyrand. And so she can be a go between once Morris, is trying to, even before he's ambassador, once he's sort of interested in political affairs, having an affair with Adele is useful politically.
I just want to also, because this just occurred to me, in the most recent episodes about various women who were scapegoated and then executed during the French Revolution, they were often denigrated as being like, well, they're whores, they're not faithful, like they're sleeping with all these men, and that makes them terrible, and that's why we should execute them. Meanwhile, the upper echelon is just like you're saying. It's like, well, she's married and she has these two other lovers, and this is the other lover, and everyone's clearly cool with this situation. So the fact that the poor women are just being falsely accused of what upper class women are just doing.
Well, and I mean, to the extent in other countries, certainly in England and America, they blame the upper class women's corruption. Basically, the reason the French Revolution goes wrong, according to plenty of people in Britain and America, is that all these fancy Salonier French ladies are sexually loose, and that is coupled with political corruption. So they tie these things together. They're not saying they should be guillotined, but they're saying it is their fault that things went wrong. So, clearly they're they're having affairs with men, and people are not complaining that the men are slutty, but the women get the blame here.
Well, and speaking of the guillotine, I'm just looking through the notes and I noticed that Adele's husband eventually was guillotined.
Yes. Yeah, and Gouverneur Morris helps Adele and her son escape so that they're safe, and he also helps the Marquis de Lafayette's wife get out.
We did 2 episodes about Marquis of Lafayette. Him and his wife, as a podcast community, we ship it. We love the two of them together. I like those two.
Well, and Lafayette is big in the US right now because we're at the 200th anniversary of his tour of America in because he came in 1824 to 25. And it was a huge deal. And so there's actually been all sorts of festivities all over the US celebrating the anniversary of Lafayette's visit.
And he's such a, just speaking with people who are going back and forth Paris to America, like he throughout, like he was one of those people. And now for a quick advertising break.
You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. If you've ever shopped online, and let's face it, who hasn't? Chances are you've bought something from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes things easier, and not just for shoppers. They make it easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. It gives you a leg up from day dot with hundreds of beautiful ready-to-go templates to express your brand style so you can get up and running fast. You can tackle your important tasks from inventory to payments to analytics and more, all in one place. You can also spread your brand's word with built-in marketing and email tools built for you to find and keep new customers. And remember that iconic purple Shop Pay button that's used by millions of businesses around the world? It's why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. Your customers already know and love it. If you want to see less carts being abandoned, it's time for you to head over to Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/realm. Go to shopify.com/realm. Shopify.com/realm.
Meta AI is the personal AI that's tailored to you, now with its very own app. It's built to get to know you, offering helpful answers and inspiration. Looking for something to add to your bucket list? Meta AI goes beyond traveling the world. It remembers you're a basketball fanatic and suggests you attend one of the playoff games. Just start typing or speaking to get the answers you need, wherever and whenever, because Meta AI is your personal AI. Download the Meta AI app, now available on the Apple App Store and Google Play.
We off? 30 seconds of carefree bliss.
Oof, like winding your hair carefree.
Oh, like using Clorox Disinfecting All-Purpose Cleaner in the home carefree.
Yes!
Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox Carefree?
He's on a roll now.
Spit toothpaste on the faucet?
You got it. You got it.
Peanut butter on the light switch.
Oh, spritz, spritz.
Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good.
Okay, we're back.
Use as directed.
And we're back. But so by the time Adele's husband is guillotined, this is the point. So that was, I'm not sure what, but Gouvernour Morris is named American ambassador to France in 1792. That's around the time of like Robespierre really taking over, like the terror is kind of gonna get going. Why do they need an ambassador at that point when everything is kind of the purge?
Well, America, I'm not sure that they discussed not having an ambassador. I'm trying to think. I mean, I haven't looked in detail at the correspondence over the naming of Morris as ambassador. There was some pushback to it, but not that I know of because of what was going on in France, more because Morris was considered to be a monarchist. He definitely believed in a strong executive and did not love what was going on with the French Revolution. But as far as I know, the Americans still believed that they needed to have diplomatic contact with France.
It's just interesting to me to say, like, he was appointed French ambassador. I have trouble. I forget that there's still a government who's like passing laws and like having meetings while on the streets are like, it's described as like rivers of blood, where it's like, yeah, but we still need to like have this meeting and who's going to take the minutes today. Like that stuff's still going on. But eventually they requested that he be replaced as ambassador.
Right, because they know that he's not a big fan of what is going on, and they think of him as a monarchist, which many Americans do too. And so then, but it's not like then they're like, okay, and we're not going to have another ambassador. Then they send James Monroe. So they send another 6 foot tall American who actually, in this case, he comes over with his wife and kids.
So, but even the fact that he's American, I guess, Gouvernour, they weren't like, we don't like you as ambassador. They weren't like, to the guillotine. They were just like, we're just going to replace you as ambassador because he's not a French person.
Well, they have to say to the Americans. I mean, the Americans ultimately get to decide who the ambassador is. George Washington is president at this point, so he's the one that names the ambassador. And actually, I mean, interestingly, Monroe gets called home and basically goes after George Washington and writes this whole report about very critical of George Washington. So I imagine, Morris and Washington would not have been big fans of Monroe after that.
There's a lot of, it's interesting to hear about historical people having these feuds with each other. I mean, famously in the musical Hamilton, we see a lot of those, but just kind of picturing that the founding fathers weren't just all like, hey, we're the guys, we're all a good team. It's like, no, these are men with huge personalities, huge men with huge personalities. So of course they got into fights a lot.
Well, and this matters actually more than you might think in terms of American politics, because people often today will say, well, the founders believed this, or this is how the founders wanted things to be. And it's like, no, which founders? Because these guys disagreed vehemently with each other all the time. And even sometimes they changed their positions on things over the course of their political careers. So do you mean, what did James Madison think when he was writing the Constitution, or what did James Madison think when he was president? It changed.
No, that's such a good point too, because it's, again, if we picture these kind of like saintly people who are just stuck in amber at one, like that painting I've seen of like all the men in the room signing the document. It's just kind of like those guys. It's like, yeah, but they lived before that and they lived after that, and they came together and signed that document together. But right away, I'm sure they were fighting about things. They weren't.
Oh, yeah. I mean, political factions developed very quickly after the Constitution. So, I mean, George Washington tried to stay above party, but even George Washington got a lot of really ugly criticism in his second term. There was even a pamphlet that described guillotining him that was published in America. He was not thrilled about this. And so, it got pretty ugly very fast.
So after Gouvernour is replaced as ambassador, he didn't go back to the U.S. He went around Europe and with his peg leg and his handsomeness and just kind of like, and he wrote all the details in his diary, just taken up with a new woman.
Yes. Yeah. He had additional affairs. I don't think he ever had a relationship like the one he had with Adele. But he certainly, was happy to hook up with whatever women he met in various European cities. And then he doesn't go back to the US until 1798.
I do want to mention one of the women he had an affair with was Adele's niece.
Yeah, that's a little troubling.
Yeah, it reminds me of Thomas Jefferson taking up with his dead wife's teenage half-sister.
Yeah. I do want to say, though, in slight defense of Gouverneur Morris, not on that in general, but that especially compared to some other men at the time, he, if we are to believe his diary, respected intelligent women and liked intelligent women. And, so you don't get the sense from his diaries that he is seducing or taking advantage of women. It's possible that he's shaping things in a way to make himself sound better, but given how open he is about all sorts of things, I get the sense of him, and certainly the person who edited his papers and other biographers of him have said, like, this is somebody who seems to have really respected smart women.
Well, and also, like, the way you described that he was writing this maybe to make himself sound better. Like, at this time, I don't think anyone would have thought, anyone who was reading his sex diary, well, they would have been like, oh my gosh. But like, if he wrote in there about like, yeah, and then like, I went to the docks and then I picked up this sex worker, or whatever. It's like he could have written that and people wouldn't have thought that badly of him compared to what he's talking about. So the fact that he's writing this, it's like,
well, and it's his diary, right?
Yeah.
So it's his private writing. But even if you look at some of his, public papers, you do get the sense that he's somebody who got along well with intelligent women.
Which I passed over this part, but I wanted to mention because we're going to talk about her later. But Jermaine DeStale
Uh-huh.
apparently tried to hit it off with him, and he was not interested. We're going to talk about her later. She had better luck with numerous other men.
Yeah, no, I mean, he was meeting all of the famous people in Paris at the time.
I will say, I have this book coming out next year about Caroline of Brunswick, her husband, George IV. It kind of reminds me of him a bit in the sense of he was really drawn to very intelligent, accomplished women as well. That's who he would pursue. That's who he took as his mistresses. And it's like, to his very slight credit, like he wanted to have somebody who like he could like have a good conversation with, like.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at then Morris's later life when he goes back to America, he had some sort of relationship, not clear what, with the author Sarah Apthorpe Morton. And she, in fact, her sister was part of a sex scandal that became a novel, a seduction novel. But she's a talented writer. She publishes poetry. And then the woman he ends up marrying later on, is also a reasonably intelligent woman, although that's not necessarily what he's praising her for. If you look at why he says he married her,
I think we need to step back because
Okay.
I do want to talk about that situation. So he hangs out in Europe, takes various lovers, and then eventually he's like, so 1798, he returns to the United States.
Right.
Do you know why he returned? Just he's like, okay, I've done this. I've done Europe. I've done the women of Europe. I'm gonna go back to, or did he run out of money or like?
I'm not sure what pushes him to go home at that point. I mean, he certainly wouldn't have thought that his political career was over forever either. So if he wanted to have other political positions, he'd need to go home. And, um, he had been out of the country for like 10 years. So he still did have family in the United States. Although he's not going home with the thought like, okay, now I'm going to settle down and get married. That is not why he's going.
That's not his vibe. That's never been his vibe.
No.
He could have gotten married at any point by now, and he still hasn't. So he went back to America. So this is, and then you're saying, so Sarah Apthorpe Morton, they're kind of
Yes.
involved. He's in America for the next 10 or so years. He still doesn't get married until he does. And so who is Nancy Randolph?
Yeah, Nancy Randolph is a very interesting woman because she also had been involved in a sex scandal. And basically, she had been accused of having a child out of wedlock with her brother-in-law and then conspiring with him to kill the baby after it was born. And there was a trial. They were putting him on trial, not her, but it pretty much ruined her reputation. And then another brother-in-law basically kicks her out of the house years later, though. It is not clear exactly why. She floats around for a while. She ends up in New York in 1809. Morris had met her when she was much younger. Unclear how he knows what's going on with her now, but he writes her this letter and is like, how would you like to come run my household as like my head housekeeper? But
Because you needed to have like in this era, who is it? There's somebody else I talked about in America. It was someone, Thomas Jefferson, I think, who didn't have a wife, but somebody had to run the household. So it was like Thomas Jefferson. It was like his sister-in-law or somebody or his cousin.
I think his daughter did for a fair amount of time. Yeah, Martha Jefferson Randolph, which actually related to, like the Randolphs and the Jeffersons are related to each other.
Fair, yeah.
So we have in Virginia something called the FFVs, the First Families of Virginia. We still have this. There are still descendants of these people around. So, like the Lees, the Randolphs, the Custuses, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, like a lot of these people intermarried over the years.
And there was a thing about like you had to have, if you were a man without a wife, like someone had to run the house. Someone had to do the job of like hosting the dinner parties and stuff. So this is part of where Gouvernour is like, I need someone to take that job.
But this is usually you have a female relative that you are not paying. He's literally hiring her to do this, which is a little strange. And he says to her, FYI, like I might hit on you, but I'll be respectful.
You know what? At least he prepared her for that. Yeah.
Right. It's a little strange. So yeah, he invites her. She, is probably not, she doesn't have a lot of great options at this point.
Yeah.
So she moves to his house in 1809, and 8 months later, they get married.
So she moves there for the job, but then at some they have a child. Does the child come right away? Is this why they get married
No,
or
no, they don't
okay.
have the child until um, they've been married for several years. So it's not about that. And I mean, it's really interesting too that Gouvernour was not in the country when the whole infanticide scandal trial with the Randolphs happened. So he actually writes to somebody he knows that had been the Richard Randolph's lawyer, the brother-in-law. And that the man who was his lawyer was John Marshall, who became Supreme Court Chief Justice, another Virginian. And basically, he says, the object of this letter is to ask of you, frankly, the reputation Miss Randolph left in Virginia. He's basically like, I sort of know what happened, but what do you think happened? And John Marshall writes back saying, it's not really clear, but you know, it must not have been that bad if she stayed living with her sister and her sister's family for the next 12 years after that. So Morris decides, okay, this is okay.
He's like, I don't know. Everything you're describing, I'm just like, he's kind of an open-minded guy.
Yeah. And I think, part of the fact that he's willing to marry a woman who has that kind of sexual reputation, because it does seem, I think she told him basically like, yeah, I had a kid out of wedlock, not with that brother-in-law, a different, the brother of that guy. Richard Randolph's brother, Theodoric, who she was engaged to. And so she does, you know, admit to this to him. But given the women he's known in France, this should not really bother him.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of opened his eyes maybe a bit, but he was already sort of this ladies' man. But I would think, yeah, like the stuff with Adele, she had a husband and kids. He's just kind of like, okay, cool. And I don't know. Actually, I just mentioned that he seems like kind of an okay person. He was also anti-slavery.
Yeah, he actually legitimately was. Like Hamilton, it's harder to make that argument. Morris was.
So in terms of the founding fathers who I've heard about, I'm just like, he's edging his way up in terms of my estimation.
I mean, he also believes that the president should have a whole lot of power to a point that makes people very uncomfortable at the time.
Okay,
So
okay.
that's usually where people don't like him.
Okay.
But if and it's we also shouldn't assume that just because he was against slavery that he wasn't a racist, because most white people had pretty negative
Yeah.
views of non-white people at the time. But I always think too of like John Adams, who is against slavery and is an incredibly morally grounded person. He is a deeply ethical person, and he's not great as the president. And I don't think he's a very effective president. He can be kind of a jerk to people, including his wife and his best female friend, Mercy Otis Warren. He writes her nasty letters after she writes a book that's critical of him. So yeah, these people, as we've said, they're very complicated.
Multifaceted people. In terms of Gouvernour being anti-slavery, did he own slaves?
I don't believe that he did. I mean, people in New York,
Because he was from New York, right? And that was like not a slave owning place at that time
when he was born, it was,
Mhm.
and there would have still been enslaved people. They had a gradual end to slavery there. There would have still been enslaved people around in New York when he was there, but I am not aware that he ever owned anyone.
Okay, so just so we have more of a fuller picture of what's up. So he marries Nancy, knowing like what her reputation is, like having investigated it a little bit, and I mean, what do we know about their time together? Was it a
So he doesn't live that much longer. He's a fair amount older than she is when they get married. And then they seem to have had, reasonably happy marriage, even though Randolph, that had basically kicked Nancy out of the house years before, comes to visit them and then writes this super nasty letter trying to slander Nancy. And I mean, okay, this line is incredible. Randolph says of Nancy, that she was a vampire that, after sucking the best blood of my race, has flitted off to the north and struck her harpy fangs into an infirm old man. I mean, yeah.
That's a good line, though.
It's good. Yeah. Oh, Randolph was he was erratic. If you look up his portrait, he's interesting. He had some kind of illness that seems to have like arrested his development. He probably couldn't have children. He had a fairly high voice. He looks like a teenager if you look at the portrait of him even as an adult.
Wait, what's his name? I want to look at it.
John Randolph. So he's John Randolph of Roanoke, and he is a very powerful member of the House of Representatives, and he's fairly widely disliked.
10 years old? He's permanently 10 years old?
Yeah, he looks very young, right?
He's calling someone else a vampire?
Yes.
And he looks eternally 10 years old? Okay.
He's also a complicated person, definitely a complicated person. And so he's trying to go after Nancy after she has married Gouverneur Morris. And he's basically trying to publicly smear her. And she writes back a 40-page reply, and then also sends this to multiple people back in Virginia, including James Monroe, to try and get them to defend her. But
wait, is it published, or is it just a letter? Like, is this a pamphlet or just a letter?
No, I don't believe that it's actually published, but he's sending he's spreading it around. And Gouverneur Morris himself is just kind of like, I know what her story is.
Yeah. Yeah, he's like, this is not news to me. Thanks, guys. But like, I'm cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a visceral reaction every time I read about the manner of his death.
Yes, so there are two famous things among early American historians about Gouverneur Morris, when, it probably should be like key drafter of the, key craftsman in the Constitution, but it is, he had a peg leg, and that his death resulted from an infection from trying to clear a blocked urethra with a whalebone. Yeah, it's pretty cringy.
It's just like I can't, my eyes are closed. I'm just like, my God. Medicine at this time was just like leeches for all. No one really knew. There was not a lot of medical knowledge in America at this time, or France or England, the places that I've read about. But like, my God.
Yeah. I mean, so he was 64 when he died. He's not particularly, a lot of the other founders lived to older than that. So, this is
how is that manner of death known? I would have thought you would hide that information from the world.
Oh, I'm trying to think how we actually know that is what happened. My guess is that his wife must have said something about this. And I think the other interesting thing about Nancy Randolph Morris is that she doesn't burn these diaries. And we think she probably did censor them, because the surviving copies of them, which are at the Library of Congress, have heavy black ink over certain passages.
Like intentionally, or like, oh no, I just dropped a blob of ink.
Intentionally
like,
blacked out passages.
Yeah.
And so even the stuff that we can read that's fairly dirty, the fact that much got through is kind of amazing. We have no idea what is under that black ink. They tried at the Library of Congress to use technology to read through, and they couldn't. It is the same ink that he wrote it with, so apparently you can't really distinguish. And so there is the most up-to-date publication of the diary is through this database, the American Founding Era database, through UVA Press, which you have to have a subscription or go to a library that has one to see this. But what they did, there's an edition of the diary that was published in 1939 by a descendant who did put a lot of the sort of stuff that had been cut out of earlier editions back in. And then they've also noted anywhere that's illegible because it was covered in ink, so that you can have a clear sense of what was censored. And there are some places where they were able to find wording that they added back in that 1939 edition had left out. But I think we have to both be thankful that Nancy Randolph Morris saved this diary, and then frustrated that she probably censored it to a degree that we can't know everything.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. Like, what I'm grateful that she saved the diary because a lot of people's diaries were destroyed. But also, what would she have thought was worth censoring is interesting to think about. Like, that she kept in so much of the stuff that she kept in. So it's
Yeah.
like, well, what? And maybe it was, I don't know, financial crimes. Maybe it wasn't even something sexy, but I assume it was
Oh, no.
something sexy.
If you look at the context
Oh.
around the places that the words are illegible or because they've been, or a whole line has been blocked out,
Yeah.
it seems,
Okay, it's sexy.
yeah.
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 That's so fascinating. I had never, ever, ever heard of this person. How well known is he to like the average American who knows about the founding era?
Okay, so the average American knows almost nothing about the founding era, but for the people who do, I think even he's not that well known among even people who know about the
If you've
founders.
got like the tiers, tier 1 is like George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, like if that's them, tier 2 is where I would put Hamilton, Burr, because I had never heard of them until the musical, personally. I've
Yeah,
heard about
so
the
he's
other ones from like
he-
sitcoms.
yeah, he's probably that tier.
Okay.
And then so one of the most expensive signatures to purchase from the era is this guy Budden Gwinnett from Georgia who signed the Declaration, and we don't know that much about him, but it's an interesting name and people collect the signatures. So that's like a level down.
Budden Gwinnett.
Yes.
It's a good name.
Yes.
That sounds not like a person from then. That sounds like the name of actually a politician from today, probably. But Budden Gwinnett. It just makes me happy when someone's not called John or Martha.
No, so there are all sorts of people who were involved in the founding that we don't know that much about, or most Americans haven't heard of. I think other than the Hamilton musical, I would put like Hamilton, Burr, Morris around the same level.
Yeah. And I do want to just mention so everybody knows that Nancy and Gouvernour did have a son, and he was in fact called Gouvernour II. Right?
And they had descendants who then, it was a granddaughter first published an edition of the diary in 1888, and then the great-granddaughter published a less censored version of it in 1939. So I presume that there are still descendants out there.
And I'm sure that a lot of them have the middle name Gouvernour.
Probably.
Just how do they pronounce it? Who's to say? I live in a mostly English-speaking Canadian city, and although I grew up on the East Coast where there's like more French influence, and the way that people here pronounce French words is phonetic, I would say, and shocking to me. So I could see that somebody might just if someone has this name today, they might call it Governor.
Who knows? And I tend to wonder how people pronounced French names in America back then too, given that most people didn't speak French. I mean, Gouvernour Morris did, but most people didn't.
Yeah, I was fascinated at first when I realized that his Gouvernour was his name and not his job title. And then just kind of like going through like, well, who is this person? I'm like, oh my God. And then I got to the end, I'm like, oh no. But
yes, he came to a sad end.
He came to a sad and cringing sort of Saw movie franchise adjacent. But so you have a whole episode that's just about this whole thing, what we've just talked about, right?
Right. Yes.
And then what are the other episodes of your course?
So the other episodes, there is an episode on the Reynolds affair with Alexander Hamilton. There's an episode on seduction novels, including The Coquette, which I mentioned. Then the Morris episode, there's an episode on Aaron Burr,
who I didn't know was kind of on a Gouvernour level of just kind of like
I would say
Lothario-ness.
worse because, I mean, he also kept a diary while in Europe about 20 years later, and he was mostly with prostitutes from what he's saying. And it's kind of gross to read. I was disgusted by him.
I want to say with Aaron Burr, I guess in the musical Hamilton, where they're really putting the two on the opposite sides, like Hamilton and Burr. So if Hamilton is kind of this guy who like is kind of sexy and dangerous and like has affairs, it's like you have to make Burr seem very upstanding and uptight.
Yeah, that's not Burr.
Yeah, so that's fascinating to me.
I mean, as I
Yeah.
explained in the episode, like the woman he married, they started dating when she was married to somebody else who was fighting for the British in the Revolution. So,
So it's funny that Burr, to someone like me, is, I just think like, oh, he's like the upstanding, kind of like almost boring, conventional. It's like, no, they are all dirtbags. So note to
yes, then
self.
I have an episode on presidential sex scandals, which includes Sally Hemings. But interestingly, in terms of what were public scandals at the time, that was less of a scandal than this white woman that he tried to force himself on at some point. And then also talk a little bit in that episode about Andrew Jackson, who's got his own scandals involved. And then I finish up, this is only very loosely early America, but I just had to include this with something called the Beecher Tilton scandal, which is in the 1870s. And it was probably the most famous sex scandal of the 19th century in America. It was covered widely in newspapers. It was a big trial about an affair involving famous people who were famous at the time, and it's a pretty wild story itself.
And so how can people acquire or learn these things from you? How do you get this course? Where is it
Yes,
living?
so it will be on the great courses and Audible websites, which I guess you can get to through Amazon as well, the Audible content. And so if you already have an Audible membership, I think this falls under that. Otherwise, you can purchase it individually for the 6 episodes. I also did an earlier course for them called America's Founding Women. And there's all sorts of other history courses on there by professional historians. And then if people are interested in learning more beyond this, I have 2 books that if you want to go to bookshop.org or your local independent bookseller, those are my preferred ways of buying books. And my second book was actually with the same publisher your book is coming out with, Hanover Square, and it's called First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. And before that, Founding Friendships, Friendships Between Men and Women in the Early American Republic.
I appreciate, like, I do this podcast, but also my like day job is I work in like acquiring books for a public library. And there's so many books always published about American presidents, and people in Canada are not that interested in it. But including myself, but I like that your books are about the other people and kind of like what the world was like and what life was like. Like, I think that's more interesting to the average person than just kind of like, here's a great man and what he did. Like, there's so many books like that. So I like that your books are kind of like filling in the gaps of like the women and what were other people doing.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what I enjoy reading people's personal letters, I find a lot more fun than reading, official records.
War strategy plans.
Yeah, I mean, I live in an area of the US with a lot of Civil War battlefields, and honestly, it doesn't totally excite me.
Yeah, I think this is an important reminder to me and probably to other people too that American history is not just the study of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. There's lots of other people and other things to think about.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. I had such a good time.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Cassandra has some books that you can read, as well as this course she has coming out. So she's written a book called First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. She's also done a previous course on Audible called America's Founding Women. And of course, the course that she is here specifically talking about right now is early American sex scandals. So you can learn more about Gouvernour and his shenanigans, as well as things like the Alexander Hamilton Reynolds affair, all the sexy scandals of the founding fathers. And you can learn more about Cassandra. She has a website, which is CassandraGoodHistorian.com. She also has a book called Founding Friendships, which is about friendships between men and women in the early American Republic. And I'm so gratified that people like her are out there doing this work, because there's 1 zillion, I think that's the technical and actual number, biographies of like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, but it's like, who else was there? And like, how do we flesh out this time and place with all the people and like their weird lives they were living? And she's doing this research, and I think that's fabulous. So this podcast is called Vulgar History. My name is Ann Foster, and I'm going to be having an in-person meetup like I did in Florida, where listener Kim revealed to me that she had heard of Gouvernour Morris before. I'll be having an in-person meetup for listeners of this podcast in Toronto, Ontario, Canada on Sunday, July 20th. And if you would like to go, I will tell you where and when we're meeting. If you just just give me your email address. Basically, just the RSVP is at vulgarhistory.com/meetup, vulgarhistory.com/meetup to RSVP for this Toronto hang we're going to be doing on Sunday, July 20th. I also have written a book. That's actually how I first connected with Cassandra, because her books have been published through the same publisher that I'm working with, Hanover Square Press. And so my book is called Rebel of the Regency, The Scandalous Saga of Caroline of Brunswick, Britain's Uncrowned Queen. And it's also a sexy story about a time period where a lot of people often just think you see a portrait of somebody from this era and you're like, oh, that's just kind of like a person who's like a statue. They were just sort of like a boring oldie times person. No. Everyone back then was a straight up mess, in England as much as in everywhere that Gouvernour went that we talked about today. So Caroline of Brunswick, the heroine of this nonfiction biography, Rebel of the Regency, she was married to George IV, who was the regent. That's what the Regency era is named after. And she was German. She arrived in England and she was treated like a total outsider by the royal family, who were all bitches to her. And she wasn't going to take that. And so she just kind of went off and had her own sexy adventures. And it's a really fun story of a woman who not a lot of people know about, but I think you'll enjoy learning about her as much as I enjoyed writing about her. My book, Rebel of the Regency, comes out February 2026, which is a ways away, but like not that far away. And it's close enough that you can pre-order it by going to any of the major online book selling websites, as well as to your local independent bookstore. It's called Rebel of the Regency by Ann Foster. And if you do happen to order it early, or as we call pre-order, then I can give you some nice treats. So go to rebeloftheregency.com and you can upload a picture of the receipt to prove that you have pre-ordered my book, and I will see that. And then you can check off which of the free treats you want. Like you can get a free membership to my Substack, a free membership to my Patreon, or an incredibly cute paper doll inspired by the book. Because this is the sort of book that it's paper doll vibes, basically. It's kind of like if you ever read the Royal Diaries, the children's books from a bit ago, 25 years ago? It's like that, but for grown-ups, basically. It's a fun, girly time. Anyway, my book is called Rebel of the Regency. If you pre-order it, go to rebeloftheregency.com and upload your little receipt. And you can also add it to your TBR, your to be read list on Goodreads and on Storygraph. I do want to clarify that at the moment, you can only order it if you're in Canada or the United States, but as soon as I have news about people in other countries and how you can order it, I will share that as well. Hopefully I'll also have news about the audiobook coming up soon for people who like to listen to things like you, obviously, listening to this podcast right now, or someone who is like that. Anyway, thank you all for listening to Vulgar History. My name is Ann Foster, and until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, scripted, and hosted by Ann Foster. That's me. Editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. Transcripts of this podcast are available at vulgarhistory.com by Aveline Malik. You can get early, ad-free episodes of Vulgar History by becoming a paid member of our Patreon for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. Vulgar History merchandise is available at vulgarhistory.com/store for Americans, and for everyone else at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. Follow us on social media at Vulgar History Pod, and get in touch with me via email at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com.
Can you actually change your personality if you want to? How does peer pressure work, and why is it so powerful? Should you ever really trust your gut when you make a big decision? These are just a few of the topics we've recently covered on my podcast, Something You Should Know. I'm the host, Mike Carruthers, and each episode of Something You Should Know covers multiple topics that are likely relevant to you. You'll discover things you can use in your life today, right now, like how to have a great conversation, how to be more courageous, the anatomy of the perfect apology, and much, much more. To date, there are over 1,000 episodes of Something You Should Know, and we've gotten over 4,000 mostly 5-star reviews. I invite you to check out Something You Should Know. Look for the bright yellow light bulb on the blue background. Something You Should Know, wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'm Amy Nicholson, the film critic for the LA Times.
And I'm Paul Scheer, an actor, writer, and director. You might know me from The League, Veep, or my non-eligible for Academy Award role in Twisters.
We love movies, and we come at them from different perspectives.
Yeah, like Amy thinks that, Joe Pesci was miscast in Goodfellas, and I don't.
He's too old. Let's not forget that Paul thinks that Dune 2 is overrated.
It is.
Anyway, despite this, we come together to host Unspooled, a podcast where we talk about good movies, critical hits,
fan favorites, must-sees, and in case you missed them.
We're talking Parasite to Home Alone.
From Grease to The Dark Knight.
We've done deep dives on popcorn flicks. We've talked about why Independence Day deserves a second look.
And we've talked about horror movies, some that you've never even heard of, like Ganja and Hess.
So if you love movies like we do, come along on our cinematic adventure.
Listen to Unspooled wherever you get your podcasts.
And don't forget to hit the follow button.
You might think you know fairy tales, and you might think that they are cute and sweet and boring. But the real Grimm fairy tales were not cute at all. They were very dark, and they were often very grim. On Grim, Grimmer, Grimmest, we tell a Grimm fairy tale to a bunch of kids. Perfect for car rides or screen-free entertainment, Grim, Grimmer, Grimmest activates kids' imaginations and instigates fun conversations. Because fairy tales speak to all of us at a very deep, primal level, and they raise interesting topics and questions that are worth chewing over together as a family. Every episode is rated Grim, Grimmer, or Grimmest, so you, your kids, your whole family can choose what is the right level of grim for you. Though, if you're listening with Grandma, she's just gonna go for Grimmest. Trust me on this one. Tune in to Grim, Grimmer, Grimmest, and our new season, available now.